Chapter 6. Smaug the Mighty. The sun appeared most mornings like a pinprick in a counterpane, like a rent in the dusky coverlet of the dawn sky. On this particular morning an ephemeral mist hung just above the water and a bright nebulous sun burned brilliantly through the morning haze. Under the circumstances, what with the black sail having followed them at a distance all the previous day, leaving each of them with something of an uneasy feeling, no one wanted to say what an eerie effect the mist gave. But still, that was exactly what it was, eerie, and they each one half expected the other boat to suddenly appear, rending the mist to bear down upon them. But it did not, and by mid-morning the mist had burned off and the black sail was nowhere to be seen. When and where the other boat had gone they did not know, and though it had remained where it lay, certainly until sunset when the light had faded, it would appear that, come the morning, the mysterious boat had departed, leaving those of the farthing to go about their work. Still, the shadow of misgiving that the black sail had cast upon them remained and left them feeling agitated and unsettled, a feeling made all the worse for Peppercorn, who could not shake the image of the dark figure who had poured over them as they slept. Though he was sure it was naught but a dream, it left him feeling exposed and vitiated. Baldwin too awoke feeling uneasy from the fading of his nighttime visions, and though he could not now remember the details of his dreams, it left him with a feeling of dark foreboding. "What is it ails you?" Peppercorn asked after breakfast, seeing the lacklustre with which Baldwin had poked at his food. "The mage frightens me," Baldwin said, straightway feeling his explanation unsatisfactory. "Elisande frightens me," he said once more, "for your sake, Peppercorn. I do not think he means you harm, but I fear that you will come to harm because of him all the same." Peppercorn smiled with philosophical calmness, as he always did when faced with troubles. "You haven't to worry about me, Baldwin," he said, brushing off his friend's concerns. "You worry too much. It will all be okay, just you wait and see." Baldwin was used to being dismissed in this way. Nonetheless, he swore to himself that he would take a closer watch of his friend and remain by his side whenever possible, lest he should need his help. It had been decided the evening before that the spot where now they were anchored was in broad proximity to where Elisande had calculated the old city had been, and therefore the remains of the dragon too. At any rate, it was as good a place to start searching as any, and by searching, of course, they meant diving, swimming down through the cold, dark waters to the lake's bed, there to search amongst the weed and shingle to see if they couldn't find some trace of the dragon's treasure. This part of the task, it had been decided, would fall to Peppercorn, not because he was the only one of the crew who could swim, far from it. They could all swim, and had been able to since infancy. Peppercorn was the strongest swimmer, that much was undisputed, but more than that, he had long ago taken upon himself responsibility for these boys, and like any good parent, he was not willing to put any of them at risk undertaking a task that he could do himself. That did not mean he relished the idea of diving to the lake's bottom, nor did it mean that he was not secretly more than a little worried, for it did not matter how good or strong a swimmer he was, he would eventually need to come back up for air, and therein lay the danger. Peppercorn had taken a sounding just after breakfast, when all but Elisande were busy with their work of cleaning and scrubbing, and Elisande was about his work of filling and lighting his pipe. Letting out the line, the plum had hit the bottom at 5 fathoms. Though he had said nothing, he had felt very relieved, for though this was deep enough, and beyond the skills of even some seasoned swimmers, he had dived such depths before. Like all of the children of Laketown, Peppercorn was a competent swimmer, and like many, had at one time or another been employed in diving for the food and treasures to be found at the bottom of the lake, crabs and crayfish, oysters and pearls, but that was in the relative shallows at the edges of the lake, 10 or 20 feet at most. This was another thing altogether. This was just shy of 30 feet. It was a perilous and risky undertaking, he knew. If he did not dive for want of breath, he may well freeze to death, for the waters of the long lake were black and cold all year round, whatever the season, and colder the deeper you went. No, he was aware of the danger all right, and had determined it was his alone to face. When the time came to begin, Peppercorn stripped down to his breeches and felt a little cheered to have the warm sun upon his back. Around his waist he buckled a thick leather belt that had been fixed with heavy iron rings and chains. This would help him to sink, and to remain for a while at the bottom of the lake. Otherwise he would be forever fighting against the compulsion to float back to the surface. In addition, he had prepared an inflated bladder, tied at the end of a long line, so that were he to find treasure or anything of note, he could set a marker that could be seen from the surface and that he could follow back down to the bottom on subsequent dives. Sitting upon the starboard gunwale, his feet dangling into the cold water, Peppercorn could see that the surface of the lake was calm, with but gentle waves that rose softly in small white peaks, only to tumble over, folded back into the blackness. Should he actually find anything down there at the lake's bottom, it would be raised to the surface in a wooden bucket, one that had been used until then for sluicing the deck. In order for the bucket to move more freely through the water, Giles had bored a sequence of holes into its wooden bottom. "Shame to make holes in a perfectly good bucket," Giles had said, as he set to with his auger. "You cannot make an omelette without breaking a few eggs," Elisande had replied sagely, as the boy tied a line onto the rope handle of the bucket. "Once we have found the treasure, you will have gold enough to buy 1,000 new buckets, and much more besides." "Still a shame to ruin a perfectly good un," Giles mumbled. Doing what he had done innumerable times before, Peppercorn dropped silently into the black water, hardly causing a splash or a ripple, the bladder floating beside him, its line tied loosely about his waist. And then, taking a deep breath to fill his lungs, under the water he went. Instinctively he faced down to the icy darkness and kicked hard, his strong swimmer's legs and bare feet propelling him through the water, the load of the chains upon his belt adding their weight to his descent. Though the lake water was black in appearance to all those viewing it from above, under the water it was clean and clear, and without any difficulty he was able to see the Farthing's hull against the hazy sky above him, and the forest of weed and lake flora far below. A large shoal of silvery sawbellies that must have totalled thousands in number shimmered like slivers of glass before him, moving as one, tumbling and rolling through the waters, billowing like a living cloud. As he approached, pulling himself through the water, they scattered effortlessly like a fractured ball of silver light, then came back together again, regrouping as he passed. Very little light made its way as far down as the weed and silt at the very bottom of the lake. At the surface, the lake's waters looked flint black and impenetrable, daylight playing upon its peaks like sunlight on obsidian, but try as it might, the same sunlight made poor progress and did not endure through the filter of the dark waters. He stayed at the bottom for as long as the breath in his lungs would allow. It was not long, but long enough to push his way through the swaying weed and to scour the stone and debris of a small section of the lake's bed. Of course, he found nothing. He didn't expect that he would, but he filled the bucket all the same with rock and shell, just to test it out, and tugged upon the line for those in the boat above to raise it up. Meanwhile, back on board the Farthing, Elisande and the other boys watched and waited, leaning upon the side rails, gazing intently into the dark water. If they could only try harder to concentrate, they might see the dragon bones themselves, resting in the silt at the lake's distant bottom. Of course, this was impossible. The lake was far too deep at this point, and the waters too dark. They all knew this to be true, but still they squinted and stared and willed themselves to see what could not be seen. Cresson had been holding the rope that was tied to the handle of the bucket, and when it jerked in his hands, the signal that he should raise it up, he began to reel it in, hand over hand, the wet rope seething upon the gunwales until it broke the surface at just the same time as Peppercorn. Reaching over the side, Baldwin and Giles took a hand each and hoisted Peppercorn back over the gunwales, where he slipped like a newborn onto the deck and lay in a pool of water, breathing deeply of the clean air. The rest of the day was spent in like manner, with Peppercorn diving and scouring the depths, once, twice, 3 times, 4, rising for air each time, and then diving once more beneath the black water until he lost count. Sometimes he would remain beneath the water for what seemed like a long time to those who observed and waited above, longer than they would have thought possible. Other times he must only have made it to the bottom before he was kicking off to come back up, his lungs burning and screaming out for air. They stopped briefly for a midday meal of bread and fried fish, though Peppercorn ate only a few mouthfuls, and then continued again through the remainder of the day. It was late afternoon when Peppercorn struggled once more aboard the Farthing, his limbs tired, his lips blue, his flesh cold and benumbed, and declared that he was finished for the day, and that they would begin again after breakfast on the morrow. Soon evening time fell, and the sun began to sink into the distant lake. That night they sat upon the weather deck, and by the light of a single swaying lantern played gammon and smoked their pipes. Peppercorn was not much in the mood for games, but sat instead upon a coil of rope with a woolen blanket tight around his shoulders, being plied with hot toddies by Baldwin, whose turn it had been to prepare the evening meal. Soon they fell to talking, and it was not long before the topic turned once more to that of the dragon. "Do you really expect us to believe these stories of dragons?" asked Giles with unveiled disbelief. "I must confess, Master Mage," added Peppercorn with a note of regret, "I've seen nothing down there but darkness and weed, nothing that would make me believe that these tales you tell us are true." "You'll be telling us next that there really were dwarfs," said Giles, "and elves." The boys all laughed. "There are no such things as dragons," insisted Cresson. "They simply do not exist." "This is true," conceded the old man, holding up his open hand to stem the tide of disbelief that seemed set once more to engulf them. "But just because they do not exist now, does not mean to say they never did, once upon a long time ago." "Old Mother Peg always said there had been a dragon, many years ago, lived in a cave neath a hill down near Mead," insisted Baldwin, who secretly liked the idea of a life more enchanted and more magical than the life of a Laketown orphan. Oh no, not that again, said Giles. Quick, someone change the subject before we all have to hear of the Mia maid again. Smaug had lived for many, many years before he came to settle in the halls of the Dwarf Kings, continued Elisanda, choosing to ignore the general doubts and disbelief. He had flown the length and breadth of Middle-earth, pillaging and burning towns and villages, always searching out the golden jewels that he so desired. It was from this treasure, added to that which he sought out in the vaults and grottos of Erebor, that he made his nest and upon which he slumbered for 100 years. All eyes were once again upon the mage, and all ears listened to what he said, for whether or no they believed them, they all liked a good story and enjoyed hearing his tales of times of yore, and especially did they like the stories of dragons. There were many great and valuable artefacts among that hoard, he continued, once he had their attention, possessions of many great houses and venerable dynasties, precious heirlooms and ancient relics that Smaug had raked and ransacked from the many treasuries and storehouses of the castles and villages he had pillaged. There were many records made of his looting, and many histories written of his numerous crimes, of the cities terrorised and burned. When the dwarves returned to their lonely mountain to take back their home, they discovered many of these relics. Thorin found his precious Arkenstone, of course, for which he had so longed. They discovered too the Star of Anor, the crown of the ruling queen of Eriador, plundered from the Dunedain during the wars of the Second Age. Also Maglor the poet's Book of the Fall of the Noldor, a volume of sad laments engraved upon paper-thin sheets of pure gold. Not to mention the golden helm of the stewards of Osgiliath. But alongside these various treasures, there was one other notable item that was said to be amongst the dragon's hoard. Do you mean your magical talisman? Asked Baldwin. The abator, confirmed Elisanda. Yes, but it was never found. Though every coin and jewel was accounted for by the dwarves in their search for the Arkenstone, the abator was never discovered. Well, I never, exclaimed Baldwin, who, as usual, was wrapped in the mage's tale. That's a mystery and no mistake. No, not really, said the mage. It's actually quite clear, a matter of simple logic. If the talisman was not amongst the treasure that the dwarves found and catalogued, then it must have been amongst those that had lodged themselves within the dragon's scales, for talismans do not simply disappear. Well, I never, said Baldwin once more, slapping a hand upon his knee. Then it must be at the bottom of the lake, along with all them other jewels. Exactly, said Elisanda, pleased that he had convinced at least one of the young crew. For a moment they all fell quiet, each one wrapped in thoughts of dragons and treasure. At last the mage broke the silence. Turning to Peppercorn he said, I could not help but notice the small charm you wear about your neck. Of course, Peppercorn knew of what the old man spoke. It was the stone pendant, carved into the shape of a huntsman's horn, that had been tied about his infant waist when first the missus had found him. A very curious device, the mage continued. I wonder, would you mind if I took a closer look? And he held out his wrinkled hand in anticipation of the boy's assent. Without a second thought, Peppercorn reached beneath his shirt and lifted the thong upon which the charm hung over his head and handed it to the mage. Elisanda leaned close and scrutinised the pendant, turning it in his fingers, rubbing the smooth surface and contemplating its meaning. I have seen this emblem before, Elisanda said, looking up after a minute or two of careful inspection. He handed the pendant back to Peppercorn. It was called of old Valoroma, or the Horn of Arome, and is an emblem of the peoples of the East. Legend has it that Arome blew his horn to lead his servants and followers against the forces of darkness in the first ages. When he left Arda for Valinor, he sent two of his most valiant Maiar, the wizards Alatar and Palandro, into the eastern lands of Middle-earth, there to continue the struggle against evil. It was they and their followers who took up the sign of Valoroma. Unless I am mistaken, this horn was made in the east by the people of Palando. Can you read the inscription? Peppercorn asked, excited at last to learn something of the pendant. Alas, I cannot, confessed the mage apologetically. I know many of the languages and alphabets of Middle-earth, but am not versed in many of the eastern scripts. It is a regrettable deficiency in my learning. Oh, said Peppercorn, dropping the thong back over his head. Never mind. But his disappointment was hard to hide. It was midday, on the 5th day of relentless dark and cold, that Peppercorn lay dripping upon the deck of the Farthing, and, after catching his breath, finally said what he had been thinking all along. Having finished their chores for the day, the crew, with the exception of Dimmock, who was busy preparing their midday meal in the small galley, were sitting idly upon the deck. Nickel was taking his turn with the bucket line, though there had been no call today, nor for the previous 4 days for that matter, to reel it in. The mage was sat once more upon his chest, smoking his pipe and blowing smoke rings carelessly up into the still blue sky. There's nothing down there, Peppercorn said with finality, as if, after 4 full days, he had made his evaluation and this was his indisputable conclusion. We're wasting our time, he continued, sitting up and addressing the mage. There's nothing down there. Without hesitation, the old man removed the pipe stem from between his teeth and replied, "You're not looking," and then returned once more to the business of his puffing. "Of course I'm looking," protested the boy angrily. "What else do you think I'm doing down there, other than freezing to death?" he added under his breath. "You might be looking with your eyes," the mage explained, "but you are not looking properly." Peppercorn looked puzzled. He did not know what this riddling logic meant. "You are looking," the mage continued, "but without expecting to see anything. How do you expect to find something that you do not believe exists?" He paused to give Peppercorn time to consider this question. "You will not see Smaug if you do not believe he is there." "How can I believe in something I've never seen?" asked the boy once more. "You can believe the word of one who has seen such wonders, can you not?" asked Elisanda more plaintively than before. "You can have trust that I believe, and let that suffice until you can know for yourself." Peppercorn considered this proposition for a moment. "Okay," he said resolutely. "All right, I will try." "Well," said the mage thoughtfully, stroking the length of his beard, "since you have shown willing and humoured me thus far, let me see if I can help you a little." And so saying, he began to search through his knapsack and presently brought out a spool of twine, upon which was fixed a small stone weight and a hook. A fishing hook, Peppercorn realised. "What have we for bait?" Elisanda mused, more to himself, or so it would seem, than to anyone else. Looking about himself, he saw in the iron skillet that Baldwin tended upon the brazier a number of squares of bacon, thick cut with a layer of fat and rind. "That will serve," the old man continued, lifting a piece between finger and thumb from the pool of hot fat in which it sat. "It will have to." "Oi," Dimmock remonstrated, most put out to have his bacon treated thus. "That bit's coming out of your share," he asserted, but the mage paid him no heed, continuing instead to thread the chunk of bacon over the barbed tip of the hook. As he did so, he began to mutter something under his breath, a kind of chanted whisper, the meaning of which Peppercorn, who was by now paying close attention, could only guess. Indeed, the old man's antics had caught the attention of the rest of the crew, who had come over from whichever part of the boat they had occupied to join Elisanda and Peppercorn, now standing, still dripping lake water, at the starboard rail, to see what was afoot. "What's up?" asked Black Nickel, who had put down a length of old rope, whose frayed ends he had been whipping, in order to see for himself what the mage was about. "What's going on?" echoed Dimmock, partly because he was still affronted by the mage's use of a piece of his bacon, but mostly because he was not to be outdone in curiosity. Answering neither of these inquiries, Elisanda simply unwound a few lengths of the thread and, leaning out over the rail, dropped the baited hook and stone weight over the side of the boat with a plop, allowing it to further unravel. And as it ran smoothly through his fingers, Elisanda continued his muttering, chanting strange words that sounded to the boys, who were beginning to get used to the mage's outlandish behaviour, like some kind of incantation or spell. Once he had let out most of the line, Elisanda tied the remaining end to the clapper of the bell that hung beside the small galley, the bell with which Peppercorn called them each morning to breakfast. And without further explanation, he settled himself upon his chest to wait, in much the attitude of one with nothing better to do than to simply sit and pass the time of day. Peppercorn smiled to himself. He had fished the waters of the Long Lake all his life, and knew that the chances of the mage getting a bite at this time of day, using but a single hook, was slim at best. Still, he thought to himself, settling down to enjoy the entertainment, never say never. Much to the surprise of the young crew, there was almost immediately a tug on the line, which could barely have reached the bottom in the short time they had waited, and it rang the galley bell with a sudden clang. Jumping back to his feet, Elisanda began excitedly winding in the line, the lake water running onto the deck of the Farthing, until a fish broke the surface of the water. It was a large fish, Peppercorn could see, a variety called by the locals a loggerhead, with silver scales like newly minted pennies and fins of bright orange. Strangely, the fish did not fight against the old man's line as he raised it from the lake's bottom, nor did it resist being lifted into the boat. Instead, it complied with unnatural resignation to this treatment, until, with a single sharp rap to the head with the handle of a gaff, it lay dead and lifeless upon the deck. Taking up the wooden gammon board, discarded from the previous night's games, the mage sat back upon his chest, laying the board across his knees. "Birds are better for this kind of business," he explained, lifting the fish and laying it upon its side on the gammon board, holding it flat beneath the palm of his open hand. Drawing the long dirk from the sheath upon his belt, he slowly pushed the point into the fish's taut belly. "Maggot pies and crows I like best," he continued as he worked. "Blackbirds, if they can't be found, sparrows serve as well as any. But under such circumstances as these, a fish will do." Of course, not one of the gaping boys knew what he was talking about. As he spoke, he sawed the blade of his dirk in and out of the thick, muscular body of the fish, unseaming its underbelly from tail to gills with an oozing of blood and guts. Then, laying down the blade and pushing two thick fingers into the ragged gash he had made, he hooked out a bloody handful of slimy coiled entrails, blue and red worms of glistening organs, which he unravelled across the table, stretching and smoothing them as if he were untangling a skein of wool. The sight of the gutted fish and its slimy innards did not bother Peppercorn, nor any other of his crew for that matter. No child of Laketown was ever squeamish over a few fish guts and a bit of blood, but Peppercorn did think it odd to so caress and stroke the mess of entrails. When others gutted fish for a stew, the waste and trimmings went into the bait bucket, ready for the next day's fishing. But here was the mage, the fish itself pushed unceremoniously aside, pouring instead over the tangle of guts and mire as if it were spun gold. Mused the old man thoughtfully, leaning low over the fish's entrails and tracing the line of vitals with his finger as if reading the lines of a map. Then suddenly, "Aha!" he cried with finality, and so saying he immediately took up his dirk once more, in fingers flecked with drying blood and silvery scales, and brought it down with a force and a suddenness that made the onlookers all jump with surprise, chopping into the rough wooden gammon board, whilst at the same time severing one of the bloody tubes. Taking the freshly cut intestine between finger and gory thumb, the old man gave a gentle squeeze, and a dark object dropped from the tube into the palm of his hand, where he spat, rubbed vigorously with the grimy thumb, and revealed what he had found. Holding out his open palm to the dim light that remained at the waning day, and to the inquisitive eyes of the onlookers, there for all to see was a gleaming stone, a bright blue stone, cut and polished, about the size of an acorn and almost as round. "What is it?" asked Giles, who could see exactly what it was, that it was a large sapphire, and was actually asking how did it get to be inside a fish, and how did Elisanda know it would be there? "It is a sign," exclaimed Elisanda, answering both his spoken and unspoken questions. "A message from the fates, those that oversee the affairs of men, that the bones of the dragon lie beneath us. Not only that, but it is clear foretoken of the success of our quest. Do you not feel encouraged, Peppercorn?" he asked, turning to the boy and handing him the jewel. "Now can you believe?" "Well," said Peppercorn, a little unconvincingly, turning the stone over in his hand. But in truth he was beginning to feel himself convinced, for such magical things as he had seen that day were hard to deny. "It will pay for your passage at least," he said to the mage, and, since he was still half naked and devoid of pockets, he dropped the stone into the cup he had just drained for safekeeping. That night they ate a supper of pan-fried loggerhead. "Waste not, want not," Peppercorn had said as he whisked away the gutted fish once the mage had finished his display of augury. And as they ate, sat upon the deck at the mage's feet, Elisanda told them tales of the Istari, the ancient wizards of the creator god Aru-Iluvatar, of the magical deeds they undertook and their struggles against the forces of darkness. It was magical just being there, gently rocked upon the calm lake, the endless skies filled with a symphony of stars. Add to it the mage's tales and enthusiastic descriptions of magical powers, and they could each have believed it to be true. Absorbed as they were in the mage's stories, none of them noticed the return of the mysterious black sail that had appeared once more, less than a league off their stern. The next morning the sun climbed into a cold but clear blue sky, while the young crew of the Farthing rose to an air of calm but palpable expectation. The talk of the previous evening had continued on long into the night, Elisanda punctuating his tales with verses from the songs of the olden days, and the reciting of the odd poem, filling their young heads with all manner of fanciful imaginings. Baldwin had sung once more the portion of the dragon's song that he could remember, which again petered out into humming, and they had all fallen asleep with thoughts of dragons and Baldwin's recurring tune re-echoing in their ears. Their optimism did not last long, however, for when Dimmock espied the black sail lingering ominously upon the southern horizon, the unease of the previous day returned, and the sense of some impending menace came to rest once more upon them. "What do you suppose they want?" asked Nicholl, of no one in particular, as they stood together on the quarter-deck, gazing toward the southern horizon and the black sail that hung there. "I can't be certain," replied the mage, stating once more what he had said before. "But if I had to guess, I would say they want the same thing as us." "Same thing as you mean," corrected Giles, remembering what Elisanda had said about the talisman. "And who are they, anyway?" asked Nicholl. "If I am right in my guess, then they are the men of whom I told you, those who have followed my every move for the past many years." "At least out here on the lake they cannot sneak up on us or catch us unawares," observed Cresson, "for there is nowhere for them to hide, nor shadows in which to skulk." "No," agreed Elisanda, "nor is there anywhere for us to seek refuge or safety until we can return to harbour. So let us be watchful, lest we fall prey to their foul intentions. We must be at all times alert and on our guard." With this admonition uppermost in their thoughts, they continued with the day's activities. "I will swim westward a little today," Peppercorn said as he stripped once more for the day's work, "a little closer to the land, for we are a good way out here, and I can't but think that the old city would have been a little closer to the shore." and so saying he lowered himself, this time over the port side of the small boat, into the freezing water, and before diving beneath the surface, swam instead 100 yards or so westward. Elisanda said nothing, but could not suppress a smile, for he had noticed, newly tied about the boy's neck, beside the stone charm was a small leather pouch that held something round in shape, the size, or thereabouts, of a sapphire or some other acorn-sized stone. At last, he thought, the boy is beginning to believe. After a short distance he dived, just as he had for the past many days, but with one very important difference. While all those other times he had hoped to find the dragon, but expected to find nothing, this time, for the first time, he expected to succeed. Pulling himself through the dark water, he was soon once more at the lake's bottom amongst the weed. He kicked a few more times, still in the direction of the western bank, but there was nothing different here than he had seen on previous days. There was certainly no sign of a dragon. Indeed, he was just about to give up and return to the surface for breath when he spotted something sticking up from out the silt. He swam a little closer, and through the gloom he could see it was a post of rotten wood, covered in barnacles and bearded with green algae. And as he drew closer, he could see there were more posts, many more, stretching out towards the western shore. Posts and wooden piles, splintered and broken, some with spars and cross members, some with charred and blackened ends, as if they had been burned. All had some distant time been driven into the lake's bottom, from which now they protruded, broken and blackened and covered over with centuries of growth. It is the remains of the old city, Peppercorn thought, observing the array of timbers that stretched away into the distance. Quickly he rose back to the surface, eager for breath and to share his good news with those in the boat. "I knew it," exclaimed Elisanda when he heard Peppercorn's description of the timbers. "Knew what?" asked Cresson. "Don't you see? It is the ruins of the old city," Elisanda pronounced excitedly, "which means we are in the right place. If the tales have it right, the dragon plunged into the heart of the burning city. If we've found the city, then we've found the dragon. The fish in his guts were right." Excited by what he had seen, Peppercorn did not wish to waste any more time, but plunged once more into the icy water and returned to the lake's bottom. Here he swam amongst the wooden posts and piles, searching for any sign or sight of the dragon. What he expected to see, he was not quite sure. He had swum around like this for half a minute or so and was beginning to reach the limit of his breath, when suddenly, out of the murk and the weed, loomed the most hideous and terrifying sight. A huge bony head, bleached a sickly yellowish white. 2 horns thrusting out from upon its brow, with deep, gaping eyes and a lipless grin of dagger-like teeth. Panic gripped him on the instant. Unable to cry out, Peppercorn let out instead a mouthful of precious air in a silent stream of bubbles that hurried upward toward the waiting boat. And in that terrible moment, fleeting though it was, he fully expected the beast to dart forward like an eel from its crevasse, its mouth gaping wide and snapping shut upon him, and so he kicked away and prepared to swim for his life. But of course the giant head did not leap forward, nor did it so much as move, and bringing his panic under control, Peppercorn looked back and realised that the black eyes were nothing more than dead, empty sockets. Relief washed over him as suddenly as fear had gripped him, but the fact remained. In his panic he had wasted precious air, and now his lungs began to burn, whilst the pressure upon his chest grew and grew, becoming almost unbearable. The urge to breathe in, to draw a much-needed breath, was becoming irresistible. He knew it only seconds before he drowned, before he could no longer resist, drawing in a deep gulp of lake water that would fill his lungs and consign him to lie upon the lake's floor, bedfellow in death to Smaug the dragon. Fighting all his instincts of self-preservation, he forced himself to swim back down, and as the silt settled, he saw this time not just a giant skull, for that was what it was, but extending from a long bony neck of bare vertebrae lay the complete skeleton. The high arching ribs, the stunted disjointed leg bones, the long attenuated fingers that in life had formed the framework of wings, and the trailing tail of the great dragon Smaug. Wasting no more time, for he had no time to spare, Peppercorn quickly tied the line of the floating bladder onto one of the long rib bones, unbuckled his heavy belt, and then, kicking for all he was worth, propelled himself back up towards the rippled light that seemed a fathomless distance above him. He broke the surface with an almighty and desperate gasp for breath, coughing and spluttering like a dead man emerging from the grave. He was surprised to see how far from the farthing he had gone. Mustering what little strength remained, he swam excitedly back to his boat and to those that awaited his news, leaving the bladder bobbing upon the water above the dragon's remains. They pulled him from the water, still breathless, still fighting for air, coughing and gasping over the side of the boat, where he dropped, limp as lake water, to the wet deck. If it had not been for the rapid rise and fall of his heavy chest and the quick, panting breaths that accompanied it, they might have taken him for dead. "He is there," Peppercorn managed to gasp at last, between greedy breaths, pointing back out across the lake to where the bladder now bobbed. "He is there! I have seen him!" "Who?" asked Giles. "The dragon?" "The dragon," Peppercorn confirmed. "Smaug." "Now do you believe?" asked Elisanda. "I am beginning to," admitted Peppercorn with a smile. "I am beginning to." "Now do you all believe?" the mage asked, turning to the other boys. But there was no need for a reply, for he knew by the gleam in their youthful eyes that they did. It did not take Peppercorn long to ready himself and to return to the water for his third dive. They had lifted the farthing's anchor and sailed closer to where the bladder now rose and fell with the movement of the water's surface, meaning Peppercorn hadn't first to swim out to the bladder before his descent, and making it easier for dropping and lifting of the bucket. This time, he thought, he would take a good look at the dragon, for it really was a marvellous thing to behold, and it wasn't every day that something so magical jumped out from the pages of fairy tales into real life. Taking a deep breath, he plunged once more beneath the black water, kicking down towards the darkness below. Descending was not so easy without his weighted belt, which, in his excitement, he had left at the bottom of the lake, but he pulled himself instead, hand over hand, down the long line that extended all the way back to where he had fixed it to the dragon's bones. It was not until seeing the skeleton again that Peppercorn realised the absolute enormity of the dragon. He was amazed by the sheer size of it, and of what a formidable creature it must have been in life. In length, from nose to tail tip, it measured easily as long as 2 or 3 of the master's galliots, ranged end to end, and from the tip of one skeletal wing to the tip of the other, a ship or 2 again. Still, there would be time for amazement later, for now he had work to do, and so he set about searching through the silt and debris of the lake's bed, filling the bucket with stones and weed and handfuls of whatever he could find between the great bones. Did it look like treasure? No. It looked like the same rock and debris that covered the rest of the lake's bottom. Nevertheless, he filled the bucket, tugged on the line, and followed it back to the surface. His shipmates were no more impressed with the contents of the bucket than he had been, once Elisanda had dumped it out upon the deck and the tiny crabs and other small sea creatures had scurried away. In fact, they began to feel once more that the old man was deluded, that there was nothing at the lake's bottom but worthless sediment and stone which they could have guessed without going to the trouble of collecting it. That is, until Elisanda bent and picked up one of the items, a roundish, flattish piece, and gave it a good rub with his thumb. As the muck and mire of the grimy coating began to rub away, there was revealed something of a faint yellow hue. "That's gold!" exclaimed Dimmock, all but snatching the item from the mage's hand and holding it up for all to see. "It's gold," he said again, as if trying to convince his friends, but there was no need, they believed. "It's a gold coin," said Cresson, craning his long neck to get a closer look. And then it dawned on them. If that was a gold coin, then there was a bucketful more of them on the deck, and who knew how many more buckets full at the bottom of the lake. "We're rich!" cried Giles, the reality of the situation suddenly dawning upon him, and soon they were all shouting it. "We're rich! We're rich!" And they began dancing and skipping around the deck like lunatics, all except Elisanda and Peppercorn, who watched and smiled with satisfaction at the sheer joy of their young companions. Of course, they wasted no time in getting to their hands and knees and sifting through the rest of the bucket's contents, rubbing with their fingers and upon their clothing to reveal more gold and several large polished jewels. They did not come clean. 1,000 years at the bottom of the lake would not come off with a cursory rub. Only a fraction of each one was revealed, leaving the rest covered in barnacles and slime, but it was enough to see that what Elisanda had promised them, first in the snug at the Hope and Anchor, and then on their first day upon the lake, was true. They were going to be rich. That night, once the initial excitement had subsided a little, once supper was eaten and they sat once more upon the deck of the Farthing, smoking pipes by lantern light, the others, including Elisanda, were keen to hear from Peppercorn the details of the dragon's great skeleton, the manner in which it lay upon the bottom of the lake, its length and height and the span of its wings. And Peppercorn humoured them, telling them over again how the dragon reposed upon its belly, on its sandy bed. Even so, though he described it several times, still they could not believe the immensity of the creature, and what remained of the evening passed in excited questioning. It was not until they had exhausted their inquiries, and had taken themselves off to their hammocks, that Peppercorn found a moment of quiet and solitude, and was able to contemplate in their entirety the events of the day, and the enormity of his discovery finally dawned upon him. It was real. All that Elisanda had said about the dragon was true. It had existed. It flew in the face of all he had known until now, and all that he had believed, but the evidence was irrefutable. But that was not all. There was more, for if the dragon had been real, then why not those other things that the mage had spoken of? A world of dragons and dwarves, elves and demons was far removed from the world in which until now he had dwelt, a world of poverty and cold, hard work and fish guts. But what a world this new one was, a world of mystery and fascination, enchantment and magic. and now through the bones of this ancient monster, he was a part of it. It was not unusual on these nights, once they were swaying within the darkness of the between decks, for one or another of the boys to break the silence with the singing of a gentle song, a soft, melodic rendition, sung to the rhythm of the boat that rose and fell upon the calm waters. And so would the others fall asleep, rocked by the lake herself and lulled by the soft singing of their fellow boat hand. And so it was that night, while Peppercorn lay in the dark, considering the dragon and imagining how he might have looked in life, that Baldwin sung the dragon song, remembering this time more than he had managed before, and Peppercorn and his crew drifted into sleep as Baldwin sang the refrain over and again. Thus slaying the loathed worm of hell, his breath did Bard's bright arrow quell, his lifeblood shed, great Smaug was dead, into the lake's dark depths he fell. And so was established the pattern for the days to follow. Once the sun was up, breakfast eaten, and any chores for the day completed, then Peppercorn would get into the icy water and swim to where the inflated bladder bobbed upon the surface. Then, holding his breath, he would proceed to pull himself hand over hand once more along the line, back down to the lake's bottom and to the dragon's grave. Once there, he filled the bucket with handfuls of rock and sand and sediment, scooping it up from the floor between the ancient bones, before pulling himself with growing urgency back to the light, there to gulp mouthfuls of much-needed air. Those on board the Farthing would empty the bucket onto the boat's deck for inspection and begin the sorting, anything of value being dropped into a barrel, while stones, shells and sand were thrown and sluiced back overboard. And the days continued in this way and took on a regular pattern. After the first few days, Peppercorn would wait until the sun was at its highest and hottest, until he stripped to his breeches and began once more the work of raising buckets full of the dragon's treasure. Not that any amount of sun could warm the dark waters of the lake, but it helped thaw his frozen limbs, warm his flesh and dry his sodden clothing once he returned to the surface and lay, breathless and exhausted, upon the deck of the Farthing. From the day Peppercorn first found the dragon, they did not see the black sail again, or at least did not notice it, and the boys seemed to forget all about it, absorbed as they were in the business at hand. Elisanda did not forget, and though it hung no longer upon the horizon like a vulture awaiting its carrion, still it cast a shadow of unease across his mind and thoughts, though he chose to say nothing of the sort to his young companions. Least said, soonest mended, he thought to himself.